We're live.
Righty then. Hello there, everyone. The 6th of June. Tim Walz is the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats in the U.S. I guess everything is right with the world so far. This and that today, five-ish. Yesterday, we looked at new readings of Capital from a literary point of view, and I didn't get too far in it because it's a little technical. It sort of depends if you like literary analysis or lit crit. It's actually quite good. The article by Anne Kornbluth is actually quite good, but only if you're really excited about certain ideas about looking at the text itself. And there'll be a comment in today's thing, a little bit, not about the article itself, but about certain ways in which, in the sort of humanist version of the Capital, the scholars decided that they would try their hand at applying literary analysis to it and trying to sort of isolate the political elements from the economic elements, which is not problematic, but perhaps not in the right direction. But there are always, with everything in this little world we live, to look at both cultural studies and political economic studies of things. There also is, of course, reactionary stuff that claims all kinds of other crazy stuff about the text itself. And the thing I'm going to read today is the sort of preview of Frederick Jameson's work, Representing Capital. It's his reading of volume 1. And Verso sells it on sale usually. It's published in 2011. Those of you who like the trivia of this little activity, when Rick Wolf and his spouse Harriet Fraud were did a little thing in our sort of prior version of this activity. The question I asked him was actually a question based on Jameson in this particular book. And Rick's answer, of course, was from his time at Yale. And I gave a non-controversial answer, thank God. But he did mention Althusser. So anyway, so that's what I'm looking at today. This article actually appears in the same issue of the Marxist Literary Group journal called Mediations, the same journal as the article we sort of began yesterday. And so therefore it is a discussion of capital from a Marxist point of view, but it has a slightly different way of looking at it. And I hope that you'll actually read this one. This one's easier to read, mainly because it's a kind of overview. And of course, Jameson is not trying to alienate future readers because this was written before the full book, Frederick Jameson, Representing Capital, a reading of volume 1 was published. Jameson sits in a broad range of scholars who have a post-war, post-structural kind of view of reading Marx, and is not ashamed to call himself a Marxist, although I think his job path has always been, well, there's the Marxist guy who teaches in our French department or in our comp lit department or in our whatever. And so Fred's path has been an interesting one. I mean, degree from Harvard, taught at UC San Diego, Yale, and then wound up with an endowed chair at Duke, from which he retired. And I think this is one of his little retirement books in the sense that, his other books are sort of analyses that are largely literary, except for his one on postmodernism, or the unconscious, which is really quite a good little book, A Political Unconscious. And this is in the same flavor of that. but it leaves a kind of openness that you'll see as we look at the text. Anyway, I think it's worth reading. It's worth reading because I think it does it in a fairly open, fairly simple, covers all the bases that we've been sort of looking at, the question of exchange, the question of politics, all of those things are built into this. So I'll read through this. By the time I'm done, it'll be 6 o'clock, and then we can move on to other matters. So bear with me. The conclusion to draw here is not that since it is unrepresentable, capitalism is ineffable and a kind of mystery beyond language or thought. Ineffable meaning, sort of you can't express it in language, but rather that one must redouble one's efforts to express the inexpressible in this respect. And much of the problem of the analysis, well, I don't want to verge off into the lecture. I'll get right to the reading. A new reading of Capital, Frederick Jameson, from the journal Mediations. My title promises a preview of my forthcoming book, Representing Capital, Commentary on Volume 1 of Marx's Capital, which I read somewhat differently than many of the standard interpretations. So I will tell you something about that and then draw some practical conclusions about Marxism today, 2011, and its political and intellectual mission. I'm anxious that this work of mine not be understood as a quote unquote literary reading of Capital. Not only have those few such attempts been either weak, generic classifications or fairly obvious notes on style and metaphor. Indeed, the very term literary in this context is bound to trivialize the effort and to suggest that those debating the technical details of Marx's economic analyses will have little interest in cultural epiphenomena like the textual analysis of the book as such. And it is true that I take little interest in Marx's facts as he presents them or the relevance of the laws he is alleged to have deduced from them. What I have wished to emphasize is the representation of capitalism as a totality, as an infernal machine, which can only be described dialectically. I regard the truth of the labor theory of value as a metaphysical issue. I find the extrapolation of Marx's model to the current third or globalized postmodern stage of capitalism to be of the greatest interest, but think that so far, this can take many forms. And at the same time, I consider that Marx's description of capital is fully vindicated by recent events and remains as valid today as it ever was. Meanwhile, in this reading, I limit myself to the only completed work, namely Volume 1 of Capital, and I claim that it gives a complete picture of capitalist totality. I should add, to justify my formal approach, which, as I've said, I would not want to call literary exactly, but which some will certainly continue to characterize as formalist in that way. I should add that for me, the central formal problem of Capital Volume 1 is the problem of representation, namely how to construct a totality out of individual elements, historical processes, and perspectives of all kinds, and indeed how to do justice to a totality which is not only non-empirical as a system of relationships, but which is also in full movement, in expansion, in a movement of totalization which is essential to its very existence and at the heart of its peculiar economic nature. Yet also essential to this structure is a process of perpetual breakdown. So we have here a machine which is necessarily and inevitably breaking down, and which must therefore, to remain in existence, constantly repair itself by enlarging itself and its field of control. It's a commentary on economic growth in that context. How such a peculiar and indeed such a unique phenomenon can be represented or made to appear in our mind's eye is, I believe, explained by the equally unique and peculiar powers of dialectical thought, which might almost be considered a new type of thinking invented specifically to overcome the dilemmas of representation posed by this unique and peculiar totality called capital. But I will not pursue any more extensive account and defense or apologia of the dialectic here. So now we begin. and with a scandalous proposal, mainly to bracket the whole of part one. Bracketing is a slightly more technical term, and it has its roots in certain philosophical ideas about that you bracket off or frame. Well, it sort of overlaps with the idea of media framing, but it's not about media so much as it is um, it relates more to language and in fact to linguistics. But anyway, it is of course the most famous section of the whole work, the one everyone reads, even if they get no further. Nor is my proposal motivated by quite the same concerns as those of Althusser and Korsch, both of whom suggested the neophyte, that is the beginner, or the working class reader skip these chapters, at least in part because both these thinkers were, for different reasons, adamantly opposed to the dialectic as such. And the point here is that there's a period where, because of the Stalinism of the first half of the last century, you had sort of a resurgence of questions about Orthodox Marxism. So therefore, dialectical materialism was, sort of the orthodox position, and it has a certain sense to it, so that when you invoke it, it has there's a lot of baggage that comes with it. My reasons are somewhat different, although I would agree to this extent, namely that readers can become so mesmerized by the commodity form, fetishism, and the like that they cease to explore Marxism any further. I remind you that part one is what the Grundriss's editors call the chapter on money. It is not yet about capital. This is, money has here not yet undergone its crucial metamorphosis into capital, and to that degree, part one stages something like capitalism's prehistory, as does in a very different way part 8 on primitive accumulation. So that strictly speaking, Marx's description of capitalism as such can be limited to parts 2 through 7. So what he's describing is the book, volume 1, has multiple sections, and they have subset chapters, and you sort of have to. And of course, as we mentioned before, there are people like Heinrich on the one hand and Mosley on the other, who have written strictly on the first chapter because it is so sort of leading or packed. Certainly, in a society dominated by commodification, the analyses of part 1 are politically more relevant today, just as the dimension of culture more generally is in our third stage of capitalism. It's some people would describe it as sort of early capitalism, sort of high capitalism, the industrial kind of capital, modern capitalism, and then the third stage is a kind of a decline or late capitalism, and this is problematic. A lot of people have issues with this. So just so you know what the third stage of capitalism is, it's not identical to the third stage of industrialization, in fact, and so that's an issue. But anyway, nonetheless, in formal terms, I propose that part 1 be considered a kind of complete work in its own right, a kind of overture to the main work, or better still, a Vorspiel on the order of Das Rheingold, whose fundamental action will then come with the official Ring trilogy. One of the reasons for doing so is that part 1 has proven to be a fausse piste, or as Heidegger calls it, a Holzweg, a path leading nowhere. A fausse piste is a wild goose chase in French. Part 1 is essentially an attack on the very notion of exchange, on the equation which suggests that there can be such a thing as an exchange of equals, or that the equation can be reversible. This is CMC MCM. This means that there could be no such thing as a just price. And I've included below a little description of what counts as just price, which foreshadows or is structurally identical to the conversation about social ontology that we were looking at in prior weeks. It is about ethics, connecting, ethics to economics. This means that there can be no such thing as a just price. And with this, the whole project of social democracy or of the equitable reform of capitalism falls to the ground. But this result, politically productive, leads us back at our starting point with only one acquisition, namely a methodological one, which will now guide my reading of the rest of volume 1, and which I will briefly outline. His book Representing Capital is not this huge ponderous book. Let me just make it clear: the darn thing can fit in your pocket. It's all of well, it is 130 pages, but it's itty bitty type. And this is a little aside that I put in because you need to understand that a just price, because it is a set of relations about usury, is a theory of ethics and economics that attempts to set standards of fairness in transactions. With intellectual roots in ancient Greek philosophy, it was advanced by Thomas Aquinas, based on an argument against usury, which in his time referred to the making of any rate of interest on loans. It gave rise to the contractual principle of latio enormis. I want to understand plot in capital as the solving of specific problems, the resolution of specific dilemmas. But as capitalism involves many problems and paradoxes, these resolutions will involve a variety of tentative explorations, and they will take the form of overlapping waves. It's very deliberate to talk about as waves. A problem, paradox, aporia, which means a gap or something missing. Contradiction will declare itself then gradually. Its solution will become apparent, but not without raising another problem in its wake. This resembles the overlapping circuits of capital. So by the time one wave has subsided, by the time one momentum has run its course, a new wave is beginning, and a new momentum established. A new problem has raised its head, demanding a fresh set of inquiries and chapters and a whole new movement forward. So this reading of Capital will seek to identify the point at which a new conundrum arises and to indicate how it's resolved and at the same time gives way to a new one. There are 5 or 6 waves which basically structure Capital Volume 1, or in other words, organize that suspense. Now, how is this question to be answered, which constitutes the plot of the work? I hope it will not complicate this view of the text to add that. From a dialectical point of view, many of these problems turn out to be the same problem and to involve the same answer, but in a different register, in different terms, from a different perspective. So this idea of language registers, linguistic regulars, multiple coding, et cetera, all that sort of stuff is built in there. Meanwhile, I want to underscore a somewhat different aspect of the reading, according to which the structure I have just described is also punctuated by certain climactic moments or revelations. The latter are not necessarily the same as the solutions to the specific problems already mentioned. They can be, as it were, truths revealed in the course of those examinations, but not necessarily identical with their resolution. That already sets the problem. I also mean to mark a duality in Marx's investigation, which means that such climactic moments or revelations can sometimes come in 2 forms, positive and negative, say. In fact, Capital Volume 1 has in this spirit 2 separate climactic endings, which I will characterize as heroic and comic, respectively. So you can see already that he's trying to look and suggest other kinds of readings. Heroic and comic also have a Lacanian suggestion, among other things. So réjouissance is sort of kind of suggested here. But finally, on a surface level, rather than these deeper structural ones, I want to point out that there are several reading speeds that vary and succeed each other throughout the text, and which include 3 enormous chapters between the other shorter ones, and which also demand something of a shifting of gears and a modification of reading methods. Obviously, it'll be too long and complicated to do full justice to all these matters here, so I just resume the order of topics as simply and as succinctly as I can. The first problem begins with money, which is supposed to solve the equation problem of Part 1 on commodities. It is, of course, a false solution, since money is not a solution, but a mediation. And this is, we all generally accepted that. It is a duality, a thing called upon to express a relationship, but which in reality conceals relationship. This is this, sort of appearance and form issue that we've talked about before. It also suggests this money commodity thing that comes up So, you begin with the commodity and then you begin with money, then you have the commodity, then you have money, right? The original equation. And then you have the commodity form, which as an overlap, is reconfigured. The money is reconfigured as a commodity and then is transformed in that sense. So you have, this is the reason why MCM and CMC overlap. This mysterious nature of money explains why so many utopias, including More's first one, Thomas More's, have been organized around the principle that getting rid of money will get rid of the problem altogether. Now, let me stop here for a moment and just remind you of the implication of utopias, right? Star Trek's the Federation has no money, or at least Earth has no money. Even though you have money forms that become recommodified, like a gold pressed latinum, et cetera, et cetera. But it is a utopian kind of vision that is built into the Star Trek text. That's kind of the utopia, a similar utopian position is being made. All right, back to Jameson. Because if money is a genuine solution, that something like a just price for commodities and labor is possible, and therefore social democracy itself is possible. It's possible to tinker with capitalism in such a way as to transform it into a just society. And this is the goal of a lot of people. It's actually a libertarian goal. Money, property, capitalism itself rest on a deep structural contradiction, or at least a structural paradox, whose answer we know, for it is given to us in the labor theory of value, which cannot be solved by fiat money, or by tinkering either. So at the beginning of what I'm calling the main body of capital, that is parts 2 through 7, we must go back to the beginning and repose the question anew. Money is not the solution, since it raises the new and more fundamental question: how does money beget money? And the answer is not, of course, prudence, and namely by cheating and by theft, because that's what Proudhon's big objection is: corruption by class corruption. Nor does the answer reduce itself to the question of how we make a profit. That's sort of the more newer version of this, of trying to connect to surplus value, the difference between surplus value and profit. Rather, the answer is more fundamental. Money can only beget more money by being transformed into something very different, namely capital. And that's fairly obvious, I hope. This is then the reason for beginning with part 2 of capital, because capital itself does not appear until part 2. We all generally accept that. We can rephrase all this methodologically. Marx is showing us that profit and new value cannot be derived from the process of circulation. Now, this is controversial, but for some people. So in order to solve the question, we are necessarily moved forward into the process of production. And this is alone where capital, and new capital at that, can be produced. So we have consumption on page 1 of the entire book. It is that quality which is quickly bracketed in favor of quantity, use value bracketed in favor of exchange value. We have circulation, whose dilemmas are rehearsed in part 1 and end with the non-solution of money. And now finally, we have production itself, which will quickly lead to the secret and the solution of the labor theory of value, something which also explains distribution as such. Now, presumably our problems are solved. Why does Marx not conclude his book here? The problem is that suddenly time has been introduced, yet still in a merely quantitative and static non-dialectical way. And this is one of some people's issues about the introduction of time as being a fundamental quality of surplus value analysis. The labor theory of value leads to all kinds of calculations about rates of profit, on the number of hours of labor, on all those interesting combinations of variables which fed Marx's own hobby, his secondary interest in mathematics and in the calculus. But suddenly, these explorations come up against a brick wall: the limits of the working day, the legal limits of the working day, factory legislation requiring such limits, and suddenly blocking capital in its necessary expansion. We thereby come up against the first of the 3 enormous interpolated chapters I mentioned. The most famous, namely that on the working day, is a chapter which poses any number of problems, some of them ideological. How is it that government inspectors, bourgeois officials have been able to force such a legislation? What is the effect now and in the future of working class organization? and others practical, namely how the capitalists can get around these legislative limits, for they always do, or else social democracy would be possible. So now the argument must enter a new register, a new level of intensity, both in problem and in solution. And the answer, always provisional as we've seen, now takes the form of two great revelations. The first of these two climaxes is the celebration of collectivity, or cooperation as the period language has it. A free gift capital, Marx exalts, cooperative labor at once dialectically multiplies value and production. It was, of course, Adam Smith's discovery, which here becomes, if I may put it this way, a Marxian metaphysic. Marxism is not a valorization of production. It is a valorization of collective production. And the chapter on cooperation is the beating heart of Capital Volume 1 itself. But this jubilation is short-lived. The dialectic, as we know, is the union of opposites. And what is thus positive can at once also be revealed to be negative. This is that negation of negation stuff. The principle of cooperation, thus celebrated for human beings, becomes a veritable Frankenstein's monster when translated into machinery. I omit these famous passages, but the new phenomenon fundamentally transformed the problem. It leads to a far more complex theory of temporality and of capitalism's extinction of the past, but also to a whole new solution to the problem of the blockage or paralysis of the absolute surplus value by the new legislation. A theory of increased productivity, of intensive rather than extensive production of value, which will be termed relative surplus value. And to remind you, this is the difference between the length of the working day, absolute surplus value, and relative surplus value. Dialectically, however, machinery, industrial technology, which might kind of also allowed Marx to conclude his book, makes for a whole new conceptual dilemma, which takes two forms. The first is this: how is it that a labor-saving device suddenly makes for a shocking increase in the number of hours worked by labor, a fact dramatized by child labor? Hence, the economic paradox of the most powerful instrument for reducing labor time suffers a dialectical inversion and becomes the most unfailing means for turning the whole lifetime of the worker and his family into labor time at capital's disposal for its own valorization. Labor-saving machinery ought to reduce the number of laborers. Well, of course, it does that too in the form of unemployment. But then in that case, our dilemma takes a different form. Why is it, if value comes from labor, that you, that is you capitalists, strive so diligently to reduce the number of your laborers, when the more laborers you have, the more value will presumably be produced? Now that's, a paradox. Kane put it this way, yet a third form of the dilemma. Why does the capitalist, whose sole concern is to produce exchange value, continually strive to bring down the exchange value of commodities? As for the theory of temporality, that is time, it will have one astonishing and quite unexpected result, namely that here, at the opening of part 7, Marx suddenly pauses and gives us a whole new program for a 3-volume plan of capital, separating his presentation now into 3 different temporalities of production. But then at this point, also the truth of the whole process becomes clear, and Marx will definitively enunciate what he calls the general law of capitalist accumulation, the absolute law, as he calls it in the same context. The greater the social wealth of functioning capital, the extent and energy of its growth, and therefore also the greater the absolute mass of the proletariat and the productivity of its labor, the greater is the industrial reserve army. When we remember that this official sounding term, industrial reserve army, simply means the unemployed, we have the dialectical paradox in a more dramatic and accessible form. It simply means that the absolute law of capitalism is the simultaneous increase in wealth and productivity on one hand, and unemployment on the other. Now we can step back and assess the meaning and import of capital as a whole. This is a book about unemployment. Its conceptual climax is reached with this proposition that industrial capitalism generates an overwhelming mass of potentially uninvestable capital on one hand, and an ever-increasing mass of unemployed people on the other. a situation we see fully corroborated today in the current crisis of third stage or finance capital. And I think that's fairly obvious. In other words, we look at the unemployment rate, but we also know that methodologically speaking, there is sort of a need to have the reserve army, reserve army of labor. And in fact, even though you have the national data that shows people are unemployed, or there are not that many people unemployed, there are a lot of people who've pulled themselves out of the job market in some ways, and a lot of people who are relying on debt or whatever to moving back home. So we're not really a true, we will never get to full employment, but this is kind of the other sort of Baroque version of it. Anyway, back to the text. There follows some corollaries, which the Orthodox are bound to find scandalous, for I would add that capital is not about labor, it's about overwork, as exemplified by inhumanely long hours, and when those have been limited, by child labor. And it is about this famous reserve army of labor, that is to say, the unemployed. There's nothing here about labor proper, of the order of Harry Braverman's classic book on tailorization. Tailorization is the time motion study stuff. Labor and Monopoly Capital, a very famous book that probably we should read at some moment. Yet it would be wrong to think that historical development has rendered the 19th century representation of the capitalist totality obsolete or outmoded. On the contrary, what distinguishes our moment of capital from Marx's is carefully sketched in for future development. And those spaces are credit and finance capital on one hand, and imperialism on the other. And this is very important. It's kind of where we are now. Marx's own descriptions of imperialism, touching essentially on settler colonies like Australia, as we shall see, although you can extrapolate the coda on primitive accumulation to what we call imperialism today. This is why we look at settler colonialism. That's why talking about imperialism still is a viable model of analysis of looking at the difference between the global north and south. All right, back to the text. I must conclude, therefore, that Capital is not a political book. Its account of capital has no political consequences, except for a recommendation that workers organize. It has no descriptions of socialism, save for the hypothetical example of a society of associated workers in part 1. But let me explain myself more fully here. Marx is truly a political animal. No one has ever been more profoundly political in his instincts and thinking except for Lenin himself. He was extraordinarily opportunist in the good Machiavellian sense of the word, and was open to any and every possible path towards the transformation and abolition of capitalism, by unionization, by violence, by parliamentary victory, by a return to the peasant commune, or even by the self-destruction of capital in its own crisis, and so on and so forth. Every variety of political Marxist movement today, from social democracy to Leninism, Maoism, and even anarchism, is a viable candidate for Marx's agenda. Why I'm ecumenical about it, which changed as the historical situation and the development of capitalism itself changed and evolved. But there are no political programs and strategies advocated in Capital itself, in the book Capital itself, which remains, in the Althusserien sense, scientific rather than ideological. I have spoken of the twin textual climaxes of these texts, heroic and comic, and this is the moment to bring them on as evidence for my claim. The first, the heroic one, comes in the historical coda to what I have called the main body of the text, and it's summed up in the famous lines, like a hammer blow from Beethoven, the knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. Nothing is said here about the way in which socialism replaces capitalism. All kinds of revolutionary possibilities remain conceivable at this stage. One would only wish to point out that at this point, in 1867, Marx perceives a far more immediate timetable than in the Grundrisse 10 years earlier, where he asserts that socialist revolution cannot happen until the commodification of labor is universal. That is, until the world market reaches completion. You can see how kind of classical, this is actually the sign of Marx's acceptance of certain classical political economy principles. But in Marx's defense, one would want to remind oneself that in 1867, we're on the eve of a virtual world war. The clash of the great national capitalisms in the Franco-Prussian War. You recall that, right? Brings on the Paris Commune, etc. And also on the eve of the Paris Commune. So Marx's antennae were not altogether tone deaf. But now I need to add in the other alternative, the other textual climax, the comic one. In the second version of an outcome of capital, like a book or film, which posits two possible endings, like Clue, for example, capitalism simply dissolves. I give you this second delicious climax in full. And this is a thing from chapter 33 of Capital. And I put down below the complete chapter 33 from Marx, because there's a little there's a little part that precedes this quote by Jamison that is actually a little bit more contextual, and actually you should probably read that too. A Mr. Peel, the Peel of the peelers who gives us cops, and it's the PM during 1 p.m. during Victoria's reign, took with him from England to the Swan River district of Western Australia means of subsistence and of production to the amount of £50,000. This Mr. Peel even had the foresight to bring, besides 3,000 persons of the working class, men, women, and children. Once he arrived at his destination, Mr. Peel was left without a servant to make his bed or fetch him water from the river. Unhappy Mr. Peel, who provided for everything except the export of English relations of production to the Swan River. This is a very key point, because not unlike Luddism, or the Luddites and the machine smashers, machine breakers, it's not so much about the machines, it's about the relations of production. Who is being used? Who, that is labor, is being used in this process. This hilarious spectacle of the 3,000 future laborers disappearing into the bush is the other possibility of the dissolution of the system, society's agreement, as Kant puts it, to dissolve the social contract and disband. It is no doubt the anarchist solution, but I remind you that both possibilities, the triumph of socialism and the dissolution of society, were foretold already in the Communist Manifesto, namely that such momentous transitional moments consist in a class struggle that each time ends either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. It has often been lamented that Marxism seems to be a purely economic theory, which makes little place for a properly Marxian political theory. I believe that this is the strength of Marxism, and that political theory and political philosophy are always epiphenomenal. Politics should be the affair of an ever-vigilant opportunism, but not of any theory or philosophy, and even the current efforts to redefine mass democracy in this way, or that are, to my mind, distractions from the central issue, which is the nature and structure of capitalism itself. There can never be satisfactory political solutions or systems, but there can be better economic ones, and Marxists and leftists need to concentrate on those. I conclude with a few words on the current intellectual and political situation and what postmodernity and globalization both imply about it. Both globalization and postmodernity are the result, I believe, of universal decolonization, of an immense transformation of the world into a multitude of subjects equal, at least in their capacity to speak, if not to resist, oppression and domination of new post-colonial types. This is the emphasis, the current emphasis, as Adnan would talk about it, settler colonialism. This is a transformation of the other and of otherness, in which paradoxically, the recognition of the other, remember the Burns, the guy we were talking about a couple days ago, Tony Burns, he's talking about recognition. This is that same recognition. The recognition of the other entails the waning or disappearance of otherness, and in which a politics of difference becomes a politics of identity. This sort of explains the whole intersectionality issues. If the experience of the other is a wound to the existence of the ego, then this universal multiplicity of others marks its utter transformation. I've elsewhere interpreted Kohlev's and Hegel's vision of the end of history as a kind of universal plebeianization on the social and political level. And this word is meant in some strong and positive Brechtian sense as an abandonment of privilege and a new and universal equality. Now, all of those words may not mean something to you, but it is sort of the interest that we were just making jokes about last night, I think, with the lesbian military veteran who sort of expressed a very libertarian kind of point of view, sort of, why are all these people concerned with pronouns? It hides, it masks a kind of essentialist view, a biological kind of privileging, and but other issues as well. And so the universal equality, on the one hand, could be done by pronouns, but on the other hand, it may not. It may actually be the worst way forward. This equality seems to me to spell the end of the liberal notion of parliamentary or representative democracy, of that social democratic ideal which the left has always criticized and condemned. But I want to caution that the newer left ideals and programs of a direct or radical democracy are no less vulnerable. These concepts are not the solution to the new world of multiplicity. They are rather its symptom. They express the emergence of this multiplicity. They are not useful or practical political solutions or strategies. As this apparent attack on democracy may seem scandalous or even reactionary, I feel I must go all the way with my thinking in this area. It begins with a dawning conviction that Marxism is not a political philosophy, but rather an economic one. It is not a political radicalism, but an economic radicalism. It incites us not to contest or transform political power, but rather to change and transform capitalism as such. To change our whole economic system, a more radical ambition, which obviously entails political tactics, which can, however, take various different forms, depending on the historical moment. Perhaps I can make all this clear by returning to my own work on utopias and adding a new set of conclusions to it. I there posited two kinds of oppositions. The first one was the opposition between utopian models or projects and the utopian impulse. The former included the various proposals of the classic utopian texts, as well as the various historical attempts to realize utopia in revolutionary practice. The latter, the utopian impulse, designated the ever-present, often unconscious longing for radical change and transformation, which is symbolically inscribed in everything from culture and daily life to the official activities of politics and goal-oriented action. And I think you should remember that this is an important point that he's trying to make. It is a problematic bifurcation, but one I think that that currently exists and is re-problematized in every instance. All of our conflicts have this kind of issue. I now want to re-identify these two rather difficult manifestations of utopia in a new and clearer way. For I have come to realize that the utopian texts and also the revolutions are all essentially political in nature. They all embody so many tinkerings with possible political schemes in the future, new conceptions of governance, new rules and laws, or their absence. In short, an endless stream of inventions, sophisticated and naive alike, calculated to solve problems that exist on the political level. Thus, to give but one example, I will now claim that Thomas More's inaugural utopian gesture of the abolition of money, by no means original with him, was not an economic gesture, but a political one, and expressly articulated as a means of solving any number of acute social problems. In that case, I'm led to affirm that the utopian impulse, on the other hand, is profoundly economic, and that everything in it, from the transformation of personal relations to that of production, of possession, of life itself, constitutes the attempt to imagine the life of a different mode of production, that is to say, of a different economic system. Now I turn to my other opposition, which has to do with what can be imagined and what cannot, with the apparently outrageous proposition that utopias do not embody the future, but rather help us to grasp the limits of our images of the future, and indeed our impossibility of imagining a radically different future. Utopia, I claimed, is the radical disturbance of our sense of history and the disruption whereby we approach a thought of the radical or absolute break with our own present and our own system. But insofar as the utopian project comes to seem more realizable and more practical, it turns into a practical political program in our world, in the here and now, and ceases to be utopian in any meaningful sense. I will now re-identify this thought with one of the premises of the Marxist tradition, namely the distinction between the two stages of the social revolution, or if you prefer, the difference between the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat, which I will interpret as social democracy. That's an interesting question. And communism itself as such. You will now have understood that this distinction between politics and economics, between the achievable utopia of utopian planners and the deep, unconscious, absolute utopian impulse, is one between the social democratic moment and the moment of communism. Communism can only be posited as a radical, even unimaginable break. Socialism is an essentially political process within our present, within our system, which is to say within capitalism itself. Socialism is capitalism's dream of a perfected system. Communism is that unimaginable fulfillment of a radical alternative that cannot even be dreamt. If then utopia is what allows us to become aware of the absolute limits of our current thinking, then such are the limits and such is the contradiction we have become able to confront. I have elsewhere described it as a contradiction between utopia and cynical reason. If so, then it virtually produces its own slogan: cynicism of the intellect, utopianism of the will. Okay, so I know that that sounds complicated, but I think you want to think about that there is a utopian kind of set of notions that essentially comes with social democracy. You see it in utopian socialist literature of the 19th century type, but also of the 20th century type. The problem, of course, is this unconsciousness, which it signifies the Freudian Lacanian kind of a thing that has been part of this sort of thinking, and the question of really achieving really existing communism as opposed to really existing socialism. So this is that gap, that imaginary gap that was signified in the multiple revolutions since the middle, the second half of the 20th century. Okay, so that's my little reading of this. I've used my exact time up. Let me point out that I've included, what else have I included? I've included a review or introduction. This is Ed George's description of chapter 33. It's a brief, it's only a one-pager. And chapter 33, the actual chapter 33 from Marxism.org, and including the front end of that little Mr. Peel paragraph, which reads, first of all, Wakefield discovered that in the colonies, property and money, means of subsistence, machines, and other means of production, does not as yet stamp a man as a capitalist if there be wanting the correlative, the wage worker, the other man who's compelled to sell himself of its own free will. He discovered that capital is not a thing, but a social relation between persons established by the instrumentality of things. I think that that's actually a very important piece of that paragraph, but obviously he left it out for a variety of reasons. All right, so I in effect included the entirety, it's only a page, of chapter 33 of Marx's Capital, Volume 1. It's on the internet, it's not a big deal. There are links everywhere. I'm pretty much completed my yammering, so you can yammer now, please. I'll take a look at Problems with Power, Leonard Cohen, advertising on X. My impression, at least from Daily Kos, is that this is a plot by what's his name, Jim Jordan and Musk, to try and force people to advertise on Twitter, on X. This is a good comment, Kelly. I like the idea of communism being a sort of utopia of which to survive, to strive for. This leads me to think that in the discussions on choosing piecemeal or revolution, I worry that this would be labeled as incrementalism. Yes, that is always the critique. That is why we have to move dialectically, that you're always critiquing, things that would tend to incrementalism. My own self-criticism, of course, is, yes, I'm a registered member of the Democratic Party. And yes, I'm very happy that Tim Walz is the vice presidential candidate, because I think it's the optimal choice in order to achieve the defeat of Trump. Then the next step, of course, is how dedicated a Democrat am I? And am I only trying to do it for entryist reasons, which is its own kind of problem. In the Fred Jameson context, and it signifies his own interest in, for example, science fiction literature, and that is and it's actually from Darko Sylvan, who writes probably the best stuff on literary analysis of science fiction, and that is that utopias are not really the point of science fiction. It is dystopias that are the sort of permanent underlying text, so that Handmaid's Tale is really about a current situation. It's truly about a current situation, and yet it's scaring you with the future.
Thanks, Prof. Ann.
Hey, brickbats, comments? Go ahead.
I know, well, I know one, and then there's another one I only know of through his podcast, and they're Omahans. They're communists. Neither of them vote.
Mm.
And they are passionately communist. And I have gotten into the one I've met. I've gotten into I worry I scared him, because I was like, you've got to vote. That's exactly what they don't want you to do, is vote. They've got you. You're essentially a sucker.
Yes.
And I worry. And this really helps me couch my argument. And I'm going to share your article with the one I know. But those two know each other and are friends. So I'm hoping if I can convince one of them to vote, maybe the other will. So
Well,
I'm going to use your article. I'm going to use this medium, see if I can get it, send it to them and see where I can get.
Yeah, I think this is easy to read, and it includes, of course, anarchism. So essentially, you can push the boundary, and it,
Right.
you could say that people who are committed to American communism, whatever that is, that defecting, that is not voting or resisting voting, is a sucker's bet. I mean, that's the argument. It is the problem that the communists always have with the Trotskyists. That at some moment you have to have some faith in some institutions, as opposed to moving towards complete anarchy and being ideal about it and saying, well, fuck it, whatever happens.
Right.
And yet retain your politics, which is always the thing. But so that's sort of the weird problem. And also because certain libertarians believe this sort of, fuck it all nihilistic attitude rationalizes a certain kind of capitalist opportunism. That's the big problem. That's where the problem lies. That's the break between the two.
Yeah, that's very dangerous.
And yet it appeals to some people. That's where it becomes problematic. So anyway, yes, I hope they should read it, and
definitely.
Because there are other texts like this. This is not a unique text. This is a text that it's very simple. To me, it's very simple because it sort of lays out the general problems. Has a couple of problems, as one can tell, that are built in there, and I don't think he straightens them out in the book either. But it's just sort of interesting to see. It's just one view among many. It's not a perfect view at all.
Yes, which is, that's part of what makes the argument so perfect is, or not perfect, bad word, good, because, striving for perfection is always never a good idea. So thank you.
No, it's idealism. It's pernicious idealism is what, on the one hand, it moves culture in a certain direction. On the other hand, it has its, the big drawbacks are people like Christian nationalists who truly believe that, if they can just seize everything, say their secret word and, Jeebus will come down again or whatever. So,
Yeah. Or that, society moves and the perfection goal stays the same,
yes.
doesn't keep up with.
Well, it's a medieval position that they're essentially, projecting. They won't cop to it, but,
Mhm.
it's like, oh, okay. But I think you should read some medieval history to see, kind of where this Christian nationalism kind of led everyone to.
Right, right.
Oh, this always takes too much energy out of me. But I just advise people that this is readable, and I think he covers most of the bases that you sort of should bring to capital. That it's incomplete, but it does have these kind of positions. On the one hand, um, you have to say that it's not political in the sense that it's more, sort of normative in the sense that it's classical in the sense of political economy, and therefore, it has its own historical limitations. But once you see that, you can begin to see how other things operate, and that's the point.
And
Yes.
maybe you mentioned this. I came in a little late. So when are we going to get fully automated luxury communism?
It's
Uh,
I hate literary conceits. But actually, his point is the same as Jameson's here. It's like, just get out there and project the damn thing, because it is the kind of thing that we sort of need to, use as a kind of trope.
yeah, which is why I thought the comment about science fiction was interesting. I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but saying that dystopias are the real science fiction.
No, no,
Um,
you could say always, from a dialectical point of view, that dystopia is always embedded somewhere or behind or beneath every utopian text. So, for example, I'll go to Star Trek.
every utopian what?
Every utopian narrative, well, I guess you could
Uh-huh.
call it narratives,
Okay, yeah.
would have embedded in it some kind of critique of, and it's a reflection of or recognition of a current realism, a current set of defects that is a dystopian reality. So, for example, you have the Federation um, in DS9, more specifically, because I think that's where the critique occurs, um, with gold press latinum. There's gold press latinum in nearly every stupid episode, well, every episode. And you have Dabo tables and blah, 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 blah. You have all of these dystopian elements that are sort of contradicted or made problematized in the text within the context of a quasi utopia that is DS9, you know, being on the edge of the wormhole and all that sort of stuff. But you have, I'm shocked. I'm shocked that gambling is going on in this place, the Casablanca pork, and that you always have that thing that has never been fully solved. And in fact, once you come in contact with the Ferengi, it's all screwed again.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the way they work that out is to say that within the Federation, um, there's no need for currency.
What the fuck is
Uh,
going on? Stop talking about Star Trek.
no, well, we're
My
talking about
fault.
reality here, man, you know.
My fault.
Jesus, people. It's not real.
Uh, I think you better look into that statement. I'm not sure I can back you up on that. But yeah, so the Ferengi are not part of the Federation, and the DS9 is a weird situation because it was formerly controlled by the Cardassians, and it's on the edge. I think it's on the edge of the Federation.
Yes.
So you're naturally going to have this clash of economies in that kind of a situation, um, which makes for interesting stories.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Um, but the point I wanted to make is that I think dystopian fiction is important for many reasons, but fiction that shows a better system, a better reality, is at least as important. Um, because if you can't imagine a better situation, you're not likely to get it, I don't think.
Yeah,
You
that's
know.
why the idea of bracketing is very important. So, it's a sort of phenomenological term, and that you need to sort of frame these kinds of issues. That's why DS9 with putting the gamma quadrant against the what the hell is it? It's the alpha quadrant, whatever the fuck it is. Um, and it's not really a quadrant. Actually, there are one, two, three, four. There are 8 of them. But anyway.
Oh, there are 8 of them.
Well, if you have a quadrant and you use a anyway.
Oh, we got to solve this. Lane's very
No.
interested.
We digress. We digress.
Okay.
We digress. A quadrant assumes 4. That's only in 2 dimensions. If you're thinking in a 3-dimensional way, you have to have 8. But anyway, needless to say, what is it? There's the gamma quadrant, and what's the one in that Earth is in? The alpha quadrant? Is it alpha?
I believe it's the alpha, or is it yeah, I think it is. Yeah. Yeah, it's the alpha quadrant. Yeah.
All right. And in fact, it makes sense that alpha and gamma would be, you would have a wormhole there. But anyway, sorry, Lane.
Well, and you're gonna have to tell me when your birthday is so I can send you Larry Nemechek's stellar cartography book.
Oh, indeed. Oh man.
He sketches all this out.
Yes, I'm sure he does. Darn those science sci-fi guys. Are there other questions, problems, brickbats? No. I am at the end of my obligated time, so I'm going to where the hell is it? Trying to hide the debit. Blah blah blah. Doesn't have a live stream control. Where the frig is the live stream control? Or is Joe still in command of this matter? No, he may be the host, so I should be able to stop this business. Audio, slide control, show meeting. Show the video. I don't know where to shut off the live stream. Let me see if there's another way to do it. Meeting is now.
Try the emergency override, and
Yeah, indeed. I don't know if there's a